January 1983. In a quiet residential area of Brooklyn, New York, the body of Roy DeMeo was discovered inside the trunk of a Cadillac. The killing shocked even veteran organized crime investigators. DeMeo was not an ordinary mobster. By that point, law enforcement agencies had spent years trying to dismantle what many investigators regarded as one of the most violent criminal crews operating under the American mafia. What authorities eventually uncovered was not merely a story about murder. It was a story about power, about fear, and about a criminal system that rewarded efficiency, loyalty, and silence, until those same qualities became a threat to the organization itself. Roy Albert DeMeo was born in 1940 and grew up in Brooklyn during a period when organized crime exercised enormous influence across New York City. By the time he reached adulthood, the mafia's 5 families controlled vast portions of illegal gambling, labor racketeering, loan sharking operations, and numerous other criminal enterprises. According to documented law enforcement accounts and organized crime historians, DeMeo gravitated toward that world early. Unlike many future mob figures whose reputations were built primarily through extortion or gambling, DeMeo developed a reputation for aggressive street-level criminal activity. Over time, he became associated with the Gambino crime family, one of the most powerful mafia organizations in the United States. The Gambino family during this era was a vast criminal structure. At its peak, it contained bosses, captains, soldiers, and associates operating throughout New York and beyond. Advancement depended on generating money, demonstrating reliability, and maintaining discipline. Violence was not unusual within that environment, but investigators later concluded that DeMeo's crew stood apart even by mafia standards. By the early 1970s, DeMeo had become increasingly valuable to influential Gambino figures. He generated substantial profits through loan sharking and other criminal activities. Money was the lifeblood of organized crime. A capable earner could obtain protection, influence, and access to higher-ranking members. Federal investigators later noted that DeMeo excelled at producing revenue. But financial success alone does not explain his rise. According to multiple documented accounts from investigators and organized crime experts, DeMeo possessed another quality that made him valuable within certain mafia circles: an ability to enforce discipline through intimidation. In organized crime culture, reputation often functioned as a form of currency. A feared individual required fewer demonstrations of force because stories traveled quickly. Victims, debtors, and rivals understood the consequences of defiance. That reputation became one of DeMeo's most powerful assets. As his influence expanded, he gathered around him a group of loyal associates who would later become infamous in law enforcement investigations. Among those repeatedly identified in court records, investigative reporting, and historical accounts were individuals such as Chris Rosenberg, Joseph Testa, Anthony Center, and others who formed the nucleus of what became known as the DeMeo Crew. The crew operated from locations in Brooklyn that investigators would later scrutinize intensely. To outsiders, some of these places appeared ordinary. Yet authorities increasingly suspected that behind seemingly routine criminal businesses existed something far more dangerous. During the 1970s, another enterprise helped transform the crew into a major source of illegal income: auto theft. Federal investigators eventually documented sophisticated vehicle theft operations connected to members of the crew. Stolen automobiles were moved through criminal networks and shipped overseas. The scale of the operation attracted substantial profits and strengthened DeMeo's standing within organized crime circles. Success brought influence. Influence attracted attention, and attention created risk. The more profitable DeMeo became, the more visible he became to both law enforcement and the mafia hierarchy above him. At the same time, violence increasingly surrounded the crew. One figure played a significant role in shaping events during this period: Chris Rosenberg. Multiple documented sources describe Rosenberg as a close associate of DeMeo. His behavior would eventually trigger consequences that extended far beyond Brooklyn. Organized crime often presents itself as a world governed by rules. In reality, many of those rules existed primarily to protect the interests of powerful leaders. Unauthorized violence could create problems. High-profile killings could attract investigations. Actions taken without approval could threaten profitable relationships. According to documented accounts, Rosenberg became involved in activities that alarmed senior mafia figures. The situation escalated dramatically in 1979. A drug-related murder involving individuals connected to Colombian narcotics traffickers generated serious concern within organized crime circles. The killing risked provoking retaliation and unwanted scrutiny. Multiple historical sources indicate that influential Gambino members viewed the situation as dangerous. What followed revealed a central truth about mafia power. Loyalty had limits. No matter how valuable a person appeared, the organization ultimately prioritized its own survival. Rosenberg was killed. Investigators and organized crime historians have long identified the murder as an internal effort to resolve a problem before it spiraled further out of control. For DeMeo, the incident carried important lessons. The hierarchy was watching. Mistakes could become fatal. Yet despite the warning signs, his influence continued to grow. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, law enforcement agencies devoted increasing resources to investigating organized crime. Prosecutors sought stronger racketeering cases. Surveillance operations expanded. Informants became more important. Federal authorities were no longer focused solely on isolated crimes. They increasingly sought to dismantle entire criminal organizations. That shift represented a major threat to crews like DeMeo's. Investigators began assembling fragments of information from multiple sources. Witness statements, surveillance records, criminal intelligence reports. Patterns started to emerge. Again and again, certain names surfaced. Again and again, unexplained disappearances appeared connected to the same network of individuals. Authorities suspected that a much larger story remained hidden beneath the surface. The challenge was proving it. Fear complicated everything. Potential witnesses were reluctant to cooperate. Victims often vanished. Physical evidence was frequently limited. Organized crime thrived in environments where silence overwhelmed investigation. Yet cracks were beginning to appear. By the early 1980s, federal attention surrounding DeMeo had intensified considerably. Investigators believed they were dealing with a crew connected to an extraordinary level of violence. Prosecutors worked to build cases. Surveillance increased. Informants became increasingly valuable. Meanwhile, tensions inside organized crime were also growing. A successful earner could become an asset, but a highly visible earner facing mounting law enforcement scrutiny could become a liability. That contradiction sat at the center of Roy DeMeo's future. He had generated enormous profits. He had demonstrated loyalty. He had served powerful interests. Yet the criminal world he helped strengthen was now becoming increasingly concerned about the dangers surrounding him. And as investigators closed in, another question began circulating within mafia circles. What should be done about Roy DeMeo himself? By late 1982, according to numerous documented accounts, discussions concerning his future had become increasingly serious. The pressure was building from every direction. Federal authorities were advancing. Internal concerns were growing. The balance that had protected him for years was beginning to collapse. And somewhere inside the Gambino crime family, a decision was approaching that would determine whether one of Brooklyn's most feared mob figures would survive the storm or become its next victim. The balance that had protected Roy DeMeo for years was beginning to collapse. By late 1982, the pressure surrounding him had reached a level that few organized crime figures could survive. Federal investigators were steadily building cases against members of the Gambino crime family. Prosecutors were increasingly confident that new racketeering laws could be used to target entire criminal enterprises rather than isolated offenders. Informants were becoming more valuable than ever before. Across New York, the traditional protections that had shielded mafia operations for decades were weakening. For DeMeo, the danger came from two directions at once. Law enforcement wanted him. His own organization was beginning to fear him. According to multiple documented accounts, Gambino leaders had become deeply concerned about the attention surrounding the DeMeo Crew. Investigators increasingly associated the crew with a remarkable number of disappearances and homicides. Every new investigation created the possibility that someone would eventually cooperate. The fear was not simply that DeMeo might be arrested. The fear was what could happen afterward. For generations, Organized crime had depended upon secrecy. Once investigators obtained cooperating witnesses, entire criminal structures could be exposed. By the early 1980s, federal authorities had already demonstrated that they were becoming more effective at persuading mob associates to testify. The system relied on silence, and silence becomes difficult when prison sentences become longer. At the same time, investigators were learning more about what they believed was the operational center of DeMeo's violent activities. A small location known as the Gemini Lounge in Brooklyn had attracted increasing attention from law enforcement. Years later, through witness testimony, investigations, and documented accounts, authorities would develop a detailed picture of what they believed occurred there. According to prosecutors and multiple cooperating witnesses, victims were allegedly lured into the location, where murders could be carried out quickly and efficiently before bodies were removed and disposed of. Investigators later refer to the process as the Gemini method. The allegations shocked even experienced detectives. The method described by witnesses was not merely violent. It was systematic. Authorities believed it reflected an organized approach designed to reduce evidence, minimize noise, and accelerate disposal. For investigators, this was significant. Organized crime had always relied on violence, but the level of organization described by witnesses suggested something different. It suggested a crew that had transformed murder into a routine operational tool. Court testimony and later investigative reporting would portray a criminal organization operating with extraordinary discipline and efficiency. But proving those allegations remained difficult. Many victims had disappeared without trace. Physical evidence was often limited. Witnesses remained frightened, yet prosecutors continued advancing. What no one knew at the time was that another threat was beginning to emerge from within organized crime itself. The Gambino family was entering a period of instability. The aging leadership structure that had governed the organization for years was changing. Powerful figures competed for influence. Ambitious captains maneuvered for position. Internal tensions increased as law enforcement pressure mounted. Within that environment, DeMeo's value was becoming harder to calculate. On one hand, he remained an important earner. On the other, he had become a magnet for investigations. According to numerous organized crime historians and law enforcement sources, discussions regarding his future eventually reached the highest levels of the Gambino hierarchy. Some accounts indicate that orders concerning DeMeo's fate were delayed more than once. Money complicated everything. Successful earners were difficult to replace. The profits generated by DeMeo's operations flowed upward through the criminal structure. Removing him carried financial consequences. But there was another reality that could not be ignored. The investigations were getting closer. During this period, federal authorities were collecting information from a growing variety of sources. Surveillance operations expanded. Intelligence files accumulated. Witnesses provided fragments of information that gradually formed a larger picture. Every fragment pointed toward the same conclusion. Roy DeMeo had become one of the most dangerous liabilities inside the organization. The concern was no longer theoretical. If he were arrested and chose to cooperate, the consequences could be catastrophic. Historically, mafia organizations often responded to such threats in a predictable way. The system protected itself. Individual members could be sacrificed if leadership believed the survival of the organization required it. According to multiple documented accounts, DeMeo understood the danger surrounding him. He reportedly became increasingly aware that forces inside the Gambino family might be moving against him. The psychological pressure must have been immense, though historians are careful not to speculate beyond documented evidence. What is known is that his behavior during this period reflected growing concern. Associates later described an atmosphere of uncertainty. Trust became increasingly scarce. In organized crime, fear often spreads faster than information. A man does not need confirmation that he has been targeted. Suspicion alone can change everything. As 1982 came to an end, investigators were continuing their pursuit. Meanwhile, inside mafia circles, another process was unfolding. Decisions were being made, not in public, not in courtrooms, but within the private channels through which organized crime enforced discipline. According to numerous historical accounts, influential Gambino figures eventually concluded that DeMeo represented too great a risk. The organization that had benefited from his success was now preparing to remove him. Then, sometime during the closing weeks of 1982 or the opening days of 1983, Roy DeMeo disappeared. The exact circumstances surrounding his final movements remain the subject of differing accounts among historians and investigators. Some details remain uncertain. What is clear is that he vanished from public view. Days later, the mystery ended. On January 20th, 1983, Roy DeMeo's body was discovered in the trunk of his Cadillac, which had been parked in Brooklyn. He had been shot multiple times. The killing carried the hallmarks of an organized crime execution. For investigators, the death confirmed what many had already suspected. Someone had decided that Roy DeMeo would never face trial. Someone had concluded that his continued existence posed a greater threat than his murder. Yet the death created a new problem. DeMeo was gone, but the crew remained. The crimes remained. The evidence remained scattered across years of investigations. And federal authorities had no intention of stopping. What investigators would uncover next about the surviving members of the DeMeo Crew would expose one of the most violent criminal organizations ever linked to the American mafia. The downfall was only beginning. The downfall was only beginning. Roy DeMeo was dead. His body had been found inside the trunk of his Cadillac in January 1983, ending the career of one of the most feared figures associated with the Gambino crime family. Yet his death did not end the investigations that had been gathering momentum for years. In many ways, it accelerated them. Federal prosecutors and investigators were no longer focused solely on DeMeo himself. Their objective had become much larger. They wanted to dismantle the network that had operated around him and expose the criminal structure that had allowed the crew to flourish. The challenge remained the same as it had always been: evidence. Organized crime murders rarely produced cooperative witnesses. Victims often vanished. Participants maintained silence. Cases that appeared obvious to investigators could become extremely difficult to prove in court. Yet during the years following DeMeo's death, law enforcement began achieving breakthroughs that previously seemed impossible. The most important development came from a source that had become increasingly valuable in organized crime investigations throughout the 1980s: cooperating witnesses. The mafia had long relied upon the belief that members would never assist prosecutors. That assumption had helped sustain criminal organizations for generations. However, federal racketeering prosecutions, lengthy prison sentences, and growing investigative pressure were gradually changing that reality. One of the most significant figures in exposing the DeMeo Crew was Frederick DeMeo. DeMeo had been closely associated with members of the crew and later became a government witness. His cooperation provided investigators with first-hand information regarding criminal activities that had remained hidden for years. For prosecutors, insiders like DeMeo were invaluable. Documents could establish connections. Surveillance could establish meetings. Financial records could establish transactions. But only participants could explain how the organization actually functioned from the inside. Court proceedings and investigative records gradually revealed details about murders, theft operations, loan sharking activities, and the internal structure of the crew. Testimony helped prosecutors connect crimes that previously existed as isolated incidents. The picture that emerged was disturbing. Authorities increasingly argued that violence had not been an occasional tool used by the organization. It had become a core operational method. As cases advanced through the federal court system, attention turned toward surviving members of the crew. Among the most significant figures were Anthony Sinner and Joseph Testa. For years, both men had been identified by investigators as key participants within the DeMeo organization. Authorities alleged that they had played central roles in numerous criminal activities connected to the crew. Building cases against experienced organized crime figures required patience. Investigations often stretched across years. Witness statements had to be corroborated. Evidence had to withstand intense scrutiny. Defense attorneys challenged government claims aggressively. Prosecutors understood that major racketeering cases could collapse if critical details were not thoroughly supported. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, however, federal authorities possessed a far stronger understanding of the crew than they had during DeMeo's lifetime. Information accumulated from witnesses, investigative files, surveillance operations, and criminal prosecutions was gradually producing results. Then came one of the most important legal outcomes connected to the organization. In 1989, Anthony Center and Joseph Testa were convicted in federal court for racketeering-related offenses that included involvement in multiple murders. Both received life sentences. For investigators who had spent years pursuing the organization, the convictions represented a major victory. The prosecutions demonstrated a broader trend occurring across the United States during that era. Traditional mafia protections were weakening.
The federal government had become increasingly effective at targeting entire criminal enterprises through racketeering statutes. Instead of pursuing isolated crimes one at a time, prosecutors could present juries with evidence showing how criminal organizations operated as continuing enterprises. The strategy transformed organized crime enforcement. Crews that once appeared untouchable found themselves facing coordinated investigations capable of spanning decades of activity. The DeMeo Crew became one of the most powerful examples of that shift. Its rise had occurred during a period when organized crime still possessed enormous influence across New York. Its collapse occurred during a period when federal authorities were fundamentally changing the rules of engagement. Yet the story extends beyond arrests and convictions. Investigators, historians, and organized crime experts have spent decades examining why crews like DeMeo's emerged in the first place. The answers are rarely simple. Organized crime thrives where profit opportunities exist, where fear discourages witnesses, and where criminal reputations become valuable commodities. Within such systems, violence often becomes a practical tool rather than an emotional reaction. The DeMeo Crew reflected that reality in its most extreme form. According to numerous documented accounts, efficiency, loyalty, and earning power were rewarded. Success generated status. Status generated protection. But only temporarily, because organized crime organizations ultimately operate according to a different principle. Survival comes first. The same system that rewarded Roy DeMeo for generating profits eventually viewed him as a threat. The same hierarchy that benefited from his activities ultimately failed to save him. The same criminal culture that demanded loyalty provided no permanent security. When risk outweighed value, the calculation changed. The system had spoken. That lesson appears repeatedly throughout mafia history. Bosses fall. Captains disappear. Trusted associates become witnesses. Profitable crews become liabilities. The structure endures only by sacrificing individuals whenever necessary. Roy DeMeo's story remains one of the darkest chapters in the history of American organized crime, not simply because of the violence associated with his crew, but because it exposed the internal logic of the mafia itself. Power created opportunity. Opportunity created wealth. Wealth attracted scrutiny. Scrutiny created fear. And fear eventually consumed the very people who had helped build the organization. Today, decades after the crew's destruction, the investigations, prosecutions, court records, and witness testimony remain part of the historical record. The men who once appeared untouchable are gone. Some died violently. Others spent the remainder of their lives in prison. Many of the criminal enterprises that generated millions of dollars disappeared under federal pressure. What remains is a cautionary case study preserved in court transcripts, investigative files, and organized crime history. A story that began in the streets of Brooklyn. A story built on money, intimidation, and silence. And a story that ended exactly as so many mafia stories do. Not with loyalty, not with honor, but with betrayal, prison cells, and a body found in the trunk of a car.